Welcome everyone to our BJJ podcast for the month of September. I'm Andrew Duckworth and a warm welcome from your team here at the Bone and Joint Journal. As always, we'd like to thank our readers and listeners for the comments and support we continue to receive, as well as to our many authors and guest interviewers who have taken part so far. We hope you have found our two recent podcast series on the COVID-19 pandemic helpful and informative during these difficult times. We also hope that you've enjoyed our podcasts that have accompanied the Hip and Knee Society supplements for the month of June and July. As we enter the last quarter, we plan to continue to build on the range of topics we've covered through our series so far this year, with our primary goal to improve the accessibility and visibility of the studies we publish for both you as our readers and listeners, as well as for our many authors. For this month's podcast, we'll be taking a slightly different format, however, as we will not be discussing an original paper or instructional review. We'll be focusing on an excellent editorial from two of my board colleagues here at the journal, the topic of which I'm sure will stimulate some excellent and informative discussion. So firstly, I have the pleasure of being joined by our Editor-in-Chief here at the BJJ, Professor Haddad. Welcome, Prof, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to be with you.
Faris and I are delighted to be joined by two of our board colleagues here at the journal to discuss their editorial entitled Publishing Study Protocols, Maximizing Research Transparency and Spotting Spurious Statistics. So firstly, I'd like to welcome Dan Perry, who's not only our specialty editor for children's orthopedic here at the BJJ, but also the chief investigator of several excellent pediatric orthopedic trauma trials that are running at the moment. Dan, many thanks for taking the time to join us today.
You're very welcome. Hi, Andrew.
And to round off our guest today, we have the pleasure of welcoming back our specialty editor for trauma here at the journal, Professor Matt Costa from Oxford, who we all know has a wealth of experience in this area. Welcome back, Mac, and again, many thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Andrew. Nice to be back.
So, Prof, if I could start with you, before we get on to the meat of the editorial. In terms of the journal's position and how it's evolved over time with regards randomized controlled trials in terms of trial registrations and protocols, where have we come from and where are we now?
Thanks, Andrew. I think the critical thing to say is whatever kind of study we're looking at, the quality and transparency of the methodology and reporting have always been critical to the Bone and Joint Journal and are increasingly so. I think that's what differentiates us from a lot of other journals out there and makes the product very special. In terms of randomized controlled trials, these are increasingly seen within our specialties, and it's really important to us that they are prospectively registered and that the reporting is appropriate. So whereas in the past we were happy to accept retrospective registration of these studies, as of the beginning of 2018, we made it the standard for us and across some of the other major orthopedic journals that studies should be prospectively registered. In other words, they should be registered ideally very early on in the inception of the study, but certainly before the last patient is recruited or before the first outcome is reached. So I think that's become a standard that we've stuck to. We've turned down some pretty interesting studies on that basis because it's been a good 2.5 years since we set that threshold. We've always accepted that there may be the odd study that will have a very good reason for why registration wasn't completed, but this is, I think, a pretty good rule to work from, and I think everyone should stick to and start prospectively registering their studies.
Absolutely, Prof. No, I totally agree, and as you say, like many of the bigger journals have certainly moved over to that. So, Dan, we come to you next. You talk about in your editorial the transparency being at the heart of research, which is obviously intuitive, but what do you mean by that, and particularly in terms of randomized trials?
Sure. So by transparency, I mean, we need to be very clear that everyone knows what was done, at what stage. So right throughout the study, everyone needs to be really clear on what that study group was looking to achieve, what their main outcome was, so what their primary outcome was, what all of their secondary outcomes was. So that's really important when we register a study, that we register that up front and we're really honest and say, look, this is our main outcome. This is the one that we're going to hang our hat on. This is the one that's going to drive our power calculation. And then everything else is kind of, everything else is hypothesis generating. It's kind of interesting and we're going to talk about it, but it's a bit less relevant to us. We've got this really important first outcome. And then beyond that, transparency is about being really clear about how we're collecting the data, how we're conducting the study. So we can, as a reader, we can start to get a feel if there's might be any bias or any, other influence that might be driving the way that the result eventually comes out.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Dan. And so that sort of leads me on to my question for you, Matt, in terms of, we know bias and error can compromise research, as Dan's been just talking about there, but can you give our listeners some examples of how this can happen, even for randomized controlled trials where we're trying to eliminate all that bias, but also maybe for some other forms of research?
Yes, so last time I looked, which admittedly was a little while back, there's about 130, 140 different types of bias that you can have within a study, and I'm sure that list is expanding all the time. And so you've got to be very careful. I mean, one thing to say up front is that most systematic error or bias within studies is not done deliberately. It's not that the researchers are trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes or mislead. It's part of the study design and the fact that the study design is not clear to everyone up front. So in terms of examples, well, I mean, two very obvious ones are the inclusion of patients in the trial. So what does the sample, the the participants involved look like compared to the population of patients with that condition? And we describe the selection of patients into the sample that's reported in the trial by way of eligibility criteria. So inclusion criteria might be all adults with a particular fracture at a particular time and so on. And then we have exclusion criteria, excluding maybe open fractures or other particular groups of patients who might not benefit from these interventions. So setting those out up front allows you to eliminate or at least alleviate the risk of selection bias within the trial. And the important thing is not necessarily the exact detail of every single eligibility criteria, but that those eligibility criteria are reported transparently at the beginning of the study. And the easiest way to do that, as Dan's alluded to, is to register the trial up front. The same happens at the other end of the trial, and Dan's already touched on this, about reporting of outcome. So you can have reporting biases when you're actually describing the outcomes. And the easiest way to avoid that is to actually clearly identify, as Dan said, the primary outcome, the outcome of which you're going to hang your hat on to answer the question you've set in your research, and the secondary outcomes. And if they are labelled up front and everyone knows what they are at the beginning of the study, then any inadvertent or deliberate attempt to change a secondary outcome measure that might have a slightly more interesting p-value to become the main focus of the study is alleviated. So that sort of reporting bias, that sort of outcome bias is eliminated by this registration process because everyone knows up front what was planned and the reporting needs to follow that registration plan to the letter.
Yeah. And would you say, just before I move on, Matt, do you think that latter one you talked about, the fact that, looking for positive results, shall we say, is probably been the most common thing that happened in the past, but since registrations come in, it's eliminated that? Do you think that's probably one of the most important things, defining that primary outcome and saying this is what we're hanging our hat off, like Dan said?
Yeah, it's certainly right up there as the top thing. And we don't wish to cast aspersions about it. I mean, I've done it as much as anyone, particularly when I was, more junior, that you collect a lot of data and you find one bit of data that's maybe surprising or particularly interesting, and it naturally becomes the focus of your discussion section and sometimes even your conclusions in there. It suddenly becomes the focus. But of course, if you have 20 different outcome measures, one of them by chance at a significance level of 0.05 will be statistically significant. So 20 different outcomes, and 1 in 20 chance you'll get one that's positive, you're going to get one. So it's just the way the statistics works. And if you focus on that one that just happens to be significant, then you are distorting the evidence. You're not reporting what you plan to do up front. And that's where prospective registration of the study is so valuable, because then everyone knows what you're going to report. And that temptation, whether it's deliberate or not, to focus on the more interesting secondary outcomes is eliminated because everyone knows what you're going to do. And that's the principle of registration is long-standing for trials, as I think Faris said, and that's meant that reporting for trials has generally been better than for other study types, particularly retrospective observational studies. But there's no reason why you shouldn't apply the same principles to an observational study, setting out what you plan to collect from which patients, using which outcome measures, and how you're going to analyse them up front. Those study protocols are published less frequently, but we certainly publish our observational study protocols these days, and I don't see any reason why other groups can't. I think we'll give a bit more leeway to some observational studies within the journal, but for trials, as Faris said, I think that the time of publishing trials that were not registered prospectively, I think are rapidly coming to an end.
No, I totally agree. And if we come back to you, Dan, go into that a bit more detail, but maybe talking about the protocol publication as well. I mean, that's a little bit further down the line than the trial registration, but how is that essentially addressing some of those issues as well? And when is that usually completed, and what are the advantages, both, I suppose, for us as readers and researchers?
Yeah, so if you're doing a high quality trial, or, trials are hard work. They're hard work from the outset because you have to plan them and set them up and things. And so when you start the study, you've got this protocol and you know what this protocol is. And in a way, it's a good early bonus for you to be publishing that protocol, because it tells the world what the studies you're doing. If there's any other groups around the world that are doing research, it allows them to start to integrate their research alongside yours. And then that's going to make for a really awesome meta-analysis in the end. And some of the studies we're doing at the moment, there's a US group that are doing exactly that. They're taking our protocol and they're just repeating it, which in one way you could say, well, they're just copying, but they're not. They're just strengthening the research. That's what it's all about. It's all about, providing a stronger answer for patients, rather than, everyone choosing a different time point and a different outcome.
Yeah.
Publishing and being upfront about protocols really early is really important. And there's not just the protocol about how you're running the study. There's also the protocol about how you're going to do the analysis. And for us, increasingly in the sort of work that we do, how you're going to do the statistical analysis and also the health economic analysis. And they're called SAPs, so statistical analysis plan, and HEAPs, which are health economic analysis plans. And the reason we do those is because, so we've already alluded to the fact that in trials, it's really easy just to pick a more interesting outcome because it was significant. And we've all done that as well when we're juniors. You'll do a t-test and your t-test isn't significant. And you go, perhaps we'll just do a different test. Perhaps I'll do every test that this computer can do. And one of them is surely going to be significant. And it does that and it becomes significant, and that's your test.
Yeah.
And we need to overcome that, because that's just as much as badness as anything else. And that's why we publish the SAPs and we publish the HEAPs, and we try to be really, really clear about how we're going to do this. And so if anything really does show p equals less than 0.05, your magic number, which we're trying to move away from, but if anything is significant, then it really truly is significant. There really is a finding there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting hearing you all say that, though. I think it's like you say, everybody's done it in their time, and particularly when you're a junior, you're trying to find that significant result and get that paper that will help you move on. And I think, like you say, it's not done in a malice way often, but it's just to make that level of research really high. And so that actually, like you say in your editorial, these trials change people's practice, thousands of people's practice, and it's important that they're at that level. And so I think that's a really important point to highlight, like you've done. Matt, if I come back to you, in terms of the trial protocols and the registration, particularly the protocol though, what about, I think what some people are interested in about when that deviates, because obviously that can deviate during the trial or certainly in the feasibility stage. What are the common situations in which this occurs, and does that really matter, when you're publishing your trial protocol?
Yeah, I mean, everyone on this gathering has been involved in research for a long time, and many of the listeners will be as well. And we all know that, a bit like battle plans, nothing survives contact with the enemy, or in this case, contact with the patients you're trying to recruit to the study. So protocols have to change inevitably. Care treatment pathways change, new information comes along, patients not presenting, patients not wanting to take part. So in fact, I'm always more suspicious of studies where something doesn't go horribly wrong than ones where it does, really, because the truth is, the study that finished exactly as we planned it at the beginning, it just doesn't happen. That's life, and that's clinical practice in trauma and orthopedics. The key thing is about being transparent about that and saying up front what changed, when it changed, and for what reason. And if you've got a valid reason, an amended protocol approved by Research Ethics Committee and adopted by each R&D department in every trust that you're working in, and you've documented that up front, then there's no problem with that.
Yes.
And we all accept that those things change and have to make the trials work. So, yeah, I mean, some journals have gone as far as to ask for every version of every protocol that's ever written in association with the study and confirmation of ethics approval for each of those and changes to trial registration. We haven't quite done that yet at BJJ, but it's good practice. And I've never had a paper turned down by any journal that have asked for protocols where we've had a justification for it. They go, yeah, fair enough, that seemed reasonable. Yeah. And occasionally they've questioned it, reviewers have questioned changes, but as long as you've got an upfront and honest answer, I don't think it's a problem. We shouldn't be afraid of changing protocols. It's just being transparent about it.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And if we sort of move away from trials just briefly, Dan, if we come back to you, what about, registration? Matt's already alluded to it, but about other forms of research, such as, things like meta-analysis or systematic reviews. What could you tell our listeners about that?
So whenever you're doing a study, in essence, you're doing a study to find something out from the outset. And in best practice would be to register all investigations right from the beginning, and then people know what your primary outcome is, what you're looking to achieve, and they can then test how well you've done that and how reliable your statistics are likely to be. Even when you're trawling through your boss's last 50 hip replacements, you can just be a bit clear about what you're actually looking for in the beginning. It's a bit more useful than telling them that leg length is 0.1 millimeter different or something. Yeah. It's and it's the same for all studies. Meta-analysis, that you can register them with a site called Prospero, and clinicaltrials.gov, they accept registration of cohort studies and other study designs. So there's lots of places to register now. And obviously within the journals, so particularly Bone and Joint Open, that's why we want these trial registration documents, the trial protocol documents, to be really upfront and clear about the way things are done.
Absolutely, Dan. No, I totally agree. And just before I come back to Prof to discuss that, Matt, if you've already mentioned it about sort of retrospective research and registering that. I mean, I know some purists would say, RCTs are the best methodology we have to produce good evidence. And are we holding them to a higher standard than retrospective research with all these things such as trial registration protocols? I know it's a difficult argument, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so obviously I'm heavily involved in randomized trials and I'm a big fan, and they have a single really big advantage over other study designs for assessing interventional studies, and that's that they eliminate confounders, both known and unknown. So although there are other ways, statistical and clinical things you can do to try to minimize confounding, there's nothing that really does that in a way that randomization does at the moment. They're all sort of second best. So if you're testing two interventions, then I always think to myself, what are the reasons for me not to randomize people to these two interventions? Because that's the best methodology, so why wouldn't I? Mm-hmm. And sometimes there are good reasons. Sometimes you just can't do those studies. So, we have to adopt other study designs. Having said that, most questions in trauma and orthopedics are not actually necessarily about interventions. If you're looking at the epidemiology, incidence and prevalence of different conditions, you can't do an RCT to do that. If you're looking at diagnostic tests and which ones are more accurate for diagnosing patients or eliminating those diagnoses, then you wouldn't use an RCT design for that. So the important thing is that you're following pre-specified and transparent methodology, no matter what type of study you're doing. It's not just about RCTs. And as Dan said, through the Equator Network, which is the sort of quality standards for reporting of all studies, they started with trials, the consort statement, which many of the listeners will be familiar with. But there are now standards and reporting standards for pretty much every type of study design you can possibly think of. At least 20 I know are on the website now. So no matter what research you're planning or doing, there are guidelines for how to set that up, how to publish your work, register your work, and how to report it at the end in the most transparent way. The only thing I'd like to say on this point about sort of minimizing bias is involving people and setting up your data management plans in a way that keeps clinicians away from the data. Might seem a very odd thing to say, but when you've got a big data set in front of yourself and you've got that clinical background, you're looking for specific things, and that in itself is a bias in the reporting. Mm-hmm. So just as an example, we did a trial once ages ago, and Faris actually hates this trial, so I'll mention this one specifically of the two types of arthroplasty. And I was on my way to present the work in a meeting over in the US, and I was on the plane and I got the data set from the statistician just before I left on the flight. So I was working on a presentation on the way, being very prepared as usual. And I got halfway over and I realized that the two groups were labeled A and B. And at no point in the data set, the analysis, was to describe which hip was A and which hip was B. So I got off in a bit of a panic at the other end and trying to get hold of the statistician. And got a weekend, and he was probably still in bed, different time zone. And I said, Nick, what the hell is which group? He said, oh yeah, it didn't occur to me, really. I just thought they were really nice data sets, and I did the analysis, and this is what it showed, but who cares what? So if you keep the data away from clinicians and let the statisticians go at it, they don't care. They just like the data sets, and what type of hip is which is irrelevant. So
irrelevant, yeah.
That if you include that sort of thing in your data management plan, which is another step on from your statistical analysis plan, your health economics analysis plan, it's actually making sure that the database is locked and the analysis done before anyone gets sight of it. And then you're pretty much bomb-proof, because and people don't believe it, but I'm myself and Dan and so on, and normally the last people to find out the results of the trials, the statistician, the health economics, the trial teams have known for ages, and then we get told right at the end and say, what do you make of that? So And that really protects you from all kinds of biases in the analysis and so on. And it's good practice. I'm going on a bit now, so I'll shut up, Andrew.
No, that was great, Matt. And I think we'll just move to Prof as you've mentioned him. But how would you sort of drag that all together, Prof? And sort of how does our new open access journal BJO help in allowing us to maximise our transparency for these studies?
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, I think we've heard some great comments. I think the critical thing is, for any research question, there is a best way of answering that question. And for some, that'll be an RCT. For others, it won't be. But whichever the method that's going to be used, we are keen for that to be set out in advance very clearly and well documented and then well reported. And for RCTs, bone and joint open gives us the opportunity to be a repository for protocols, for the way the data is going to be looked at, the way the health economics is going to be looked at. So it's a really good way for orthopedic researchers to profile their work early in its evolution before the main study findings come into the Bone and Joint Journal subsequently. So I think Bone and Joint expands our remit. It also just gives us the opportunity to publish some sound studies that are good, well done studies, but just do not fit into what we can fit into the Bone and Joint Journal. So it's been great to see Bone and Joint Open expand and grow this year, and we hope it will serve a useful purpose for the research community.
Absolutely, Prof, and that's a really good note for us to finish on. So to all three of you, thank you so much for joining us. That was a really fun and informative discussion, and I'm sure everybody's gained a lot from it who's listening, so thanks very much, guys. And to our listeners, we do hope you've enjoyed joining us, and we encourage you to share your thoughts and comments through Twitter, Facebook, and the like. Feel free to post or tweet about anything you've heard here today and we've discussed. And thanks again for listening. Take care, everyone.